Hello boys and girls, Mrs. McPherson here. Today we're going to look at simplifying or reducing fractions. We can also call this as writing fractions in their lowest terms. So when we simplify fractions, it's the same thing as finding an equivalent fraction. However, the fraction has smaller numbers in the numerator and denominator. Now, it doesn't mean that the fraction is smaller than the original fraction, because remember, they are equivalent. It just means that we're writing it using the least amount of pieces. So we're used to finding equivalent fractions like this. Okay, I'll give you 1/4, and I'm asking you, what would your numerator have to be to have an equivalent fraction in 12ths? Well, you would go about finding this by doing 4 times 3 is 12. 1 times 3 is 3. So now we found out that 1/4 is equivalent to 3/12. 3/12 has a larger numbers in the numerator and denominator than 1/4 does. So 1/4 would be considered our fraction in the lowest terms. You can't get any lower than 1/4. Think of this as if you were to have pizzas. In this pizza, we have just 4 pieces, and in this pizza we have 12 pieces. So instead of getting 3 pieces of that pizza, you could just get the same size and just get 1 piece. So that's what simplifying is doing. Okay, so when you simplify fractions, you're looking for something called the greatest common factor, also known as the GCF. Okay, so let's find out what the greatest common factor is with an example. So I'm going to give you the example of 2/10. Okay, so 2/10 is a fraction, and I will tell you it is not written in its lowest terms. We need to simplify it. So how we're going to go about solving this to figure out what that simplified fraction would be is we're going to find something called the greatest common factor. So factors are the numbers, when you multiply them together, they equal these numbers. So for example, if I were to find the factors of 10, I know that I could do 1 times 10. I can also do 2 times 5. So my factors for 10 are 1, 2, 5, and 10. It's the possible combinations of numbers that will give you 10 when you multiply. So can you think of what my factors for 2 are? If you guessed 1 and 2, you are correct, because the only way to get 2 as a multiplication answer is to do 1 times 2. Okay, so these 2 lists here are my factors for 10 and for 2. So what you want to do now is you want to look for the greatest common factor. This is similar to the least common denominator, but instead of looking for the smallest number they have in common, you're looking for the biggest number that they have in common. And so if we look at these lists, you'll see that 2 is the biggest number that they both have in common. So when we simplify fractions, it's the opposite of making those bigger equivalent fractions. We're actually going to divide out of the numerator and denominator. So I'm using that greatest common factor to divide. And remember, whatever you do at the top, you also have to do to the bottom, and vice versa. So 2 divided by 2 gives me 1. 10 divided by 2 gives me 5. So what you just found here was an equivalent fraction that's written in its lowest terms. 1/5 is the same size as 2/10, but it's written in its smallest terms. Okay, let's look at another example. Let's do 6/24. Okay, we want to simplify this fraction. So my first step is to make those lists of my factors for 6 and for 24. So this would be a great time to use a multiplication table to find all the possible ways you can get 6 and 24 when you multiply. So for example, for 6, I know that I can do, I'm just going to write a little list up here just to think about it, I know that I can do 1 times 6. I know I can also do 2 times 3. And those are the only ways that I can make 6. You can also write these as 6 times 1, but you're just using the same factors. You don't need to write them twice. So I'm going to put this information into a chart. 1, 2, 3, and 6. Notice how I have the 1, the 6, the 2, and the 3. And writing it in a chart like this helps you to find that greatest number at the end. So let's make a list for 24. I know that I can do 1 times 24. I know I can do 2 times 12. I know I can do 3 times 8. And I can also do 4 times 6. So 24 has a lot of factors. Okay, so let's put all of these in a list from smallest to largest. So 1 would come first, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, and then 24 right there at the end. All right, let's erase the extra stuff. Okay, so now I need to look at these two lists and I need to find the greatest common factor, so the biggest number that they have in common. I can see that they have a lot of numbers in common, but remember you're looking for the biggest one. So the biggest one is 6. Okay, so now that we found the greatest common factor, let's look back at our fraction, and we're going to divide that out of the top and the bottom. Okay, 6 divided by 6 is 1. 24 divided by 6 is 4. So that means 6 24ths is equivalent to 1/4, and 1/4 is the simplified fraction. Okay, so some ways that we can find out if a fraction is already simplified. How do we know? Okay, so a big way that you can know is if the numerator has a 1 in it. For example, all of these fractions are considered simplified because they all have a numerator of 1. And you can't divide anything else out of them because the only thing they would have in common is 1. And we know that when we divide by 1, we get the same thing. So that means that these fractions are already simplified. Another way you know is if you have two numbers, but they have no factors in common other than 1. So if I wrote my factors for 2 and for 3 down, I would have 1 and 2 and 1 and 3. And the greatest number that they have in common is 1. So you get 2/3. So that's another way you would know that the number is already in its simplest form. Okay, so this is simplifying fractions or reducing fractions and writing them in their lowest terms.